Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is Mary Beth Sullivan from Bath, Maine. And full disclosure, Mary Beth is my partner. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you. Why don't we start out by you telling us about yourself, where you grew up, and how you got started in social work.
Sure. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a lovely town. I lived in Central Square, Cambridge. I went to a Catholic grammar school and public high school. I was born into this big Irish Catholic family. My immediate family, there were just 3 children. But my mom was one of 11 and my dad was one of 12. So I grew up with this huge extended family and felt grounded and rooted and loved my whole life.
And how about social work? How did you get started with that?
So my first degree was in special education. I worked with children, and after some years of doing that, I decided that I wanted to work with families. So I went to graduate school down in North Carolina to get a degree in social work. And in that experience, I did a field placement with a community action agency in rural North Carolina, a community that had no running water. And this was back in the 1980s, 1984. So I discovered poverty in that experience and the outrageous reality that people had to live in. And that changed my life in an important way. And
tell the story about how you were working in Washington during the Reagan administration.
That's right. My first job out of graduate school, I had an internship in Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan was president. I worked for the Food and Nutrition Services. And I was there during the years when Ronald Reagan declared ketchup as a vegetable. So that was an interesting experience. I did a lot of policy work. And from there, I went to Massachusetts and worked for a social science research organization that does a lot of really beautiful work. But we had gotten a grant to work with people who, to sort of study poverty. And I understood in that process that the statistics that were being generated and the folks that were doing that really good work, there was a disconnect. I was doing work that understood statistics but didn't understand the people who were experiencing poverty. So at that point I started volunteering in a soup kitchen. I decided that as a social worker who was a quote-unquote poverty expert, I didn't know enough. In fact, I didn't know anything. I only knew numbers. So I went back to the streets and have been working. I've had different jobs over the years, but I finally found my home in working with people who are experiencing homelessness and or who need support maintaining housing so that they don't end up homeless.
But along the way, you found out about a peace walk. Mm-hmm. From Latin America to Washington. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I was in this great office in Cambridge at my computer in my fancy place of living. And I met a friend at the Catholic Worker House in Boston who was organizing a walk with a Buddhist monk that would start in Panama and walk to Washington, D.C. The walk
What year was that?
The walk was to happen in 1992, 500 years after the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the continent. So the idea of the walk was to listen to the voices of the indigenous people in the South and bring those voices north. I thought it was a beautiful idea, but I couldn't quite understand who were these crazy people that had no car payments and no mortgages and no roots in their world.
That they could just pack up and go
walk
on
for 10 months in a year, walk for 10 months in a row. So it was I was so intrigued by the idea that I decided to take a 6-week leave of absence from work, and I joined the group in El Salvador and walked with them into Mexico. The experience of walking through El Salvador and Guatemala, you'd be with a community of people, walk 8 hours or more in a day, arrive at the next community, and be received by some amazing, amazing people. So the experience of walking was in and of itself an adventure, but then meeting community after community of people who had profound stories to tell about survival in the midst of really deep poverty. It was such an inspiring experience that 6 weeks later, I went home and quit my job and I sold my car, gave up my apartment, and rejoined the Walk in Mexico and walked with them into Washington, D.C.
Wow, that's quite a moving experience.
It changed my life forever.
And then, following that, you went back to Mexico for a couple of years, correct?
Right. I had no car, no job. I had no place to live. So, and I was so moved by the experience that I really wanted to return to Latin America and learn Spanish and connect more profoundly with one given community. So, by chance, I ended up in Cuernavaca, Mexico, went to school for 6 weeks, connected with a retired Maryknoll priest, and connected with a community of Mexicans who were educating around nonviolent action as a way to survive the craziness that we live in. So it was a profound experience. I lived in a very poor community, and I also did some nonviolence training in a profound country.
Well, today statistics clearly show that the gap between rich and poor is widening dramatically, rapidly. Can you share what that looks like in your world today?
Well, I work with people who are homeless, and there are a lot of structural reasons why poverty exists. It's really hard to earn enough money to pay rent in some of the communities in Maine, and certainly many of the communities in our country. No matter how many jobs you have, to earn enough money, I mean, what the federal government said years ago was that what you should be spending on your rent is 30% of your income and no more. And that is a joke in this day and age. Many people are spending 50% or more of their income in rent. There's a big push for gentrification in many communities in Maine. Certainly in Portland, people are buying up apartments and renovating them and tripling the price, or doubling the price at minimum. And that puts people who are living with government subsidies, it puts them out of the market. So it's not unusual for us to find someone who is homeless, has been living stably for many years, but the rent increase became impossible to maintain, and so now they find themselves on the streets looking for another place to live.
It appears to me that in Maine and really across the nation, that many social programs that help the poor and the mentally ill are being slashed or are not keeping up with the growing demand, the growing need. The idea of a fair society, which I think we've always at least had a general consensus in this country that we must have a fair society, that idea seems to be fading. Could you comment on that?
That's a lot to unpack. That's a big question. The fact is there are a lot of people who are homeless. And some days it's really unbearable to bear witness to the level of suffering that's happening in the streets. It's not just people who have been, who can't afford their apartments. It's people who are severely mentally ill and who don't have the community supports to help them navigate life. Or the community supports that exist can't quite navigate the reality of their homelessness. Life is very, very hard when you're living on the streets, and life is about survival. So the level of mental health issues that exist in the community is shameful, quite frankly, shameful.
And a lot of these are veterans too, aren't they? Isn't a high percentage of the homeless population across the country veterans?
There is a percentage, let me find it for you. Maybe 8% of the population, of the homeless population, of veterans. But I think the government in particular has determined that we can, at such a low number, at 8%, there's no reason why we can't decide that we will end homelessness for homeless people. The Obama administration put money into creating programs across the country to end homelessness among veterans. Let's start there. And they've really done a pretty remarkable job in the state of Maine. We've done a great job. So, but there's a long way to go still. I mean, there are people who are chronically homeless, not only because of mental health issues, but certainly the experience of war gives people, if you've been a combat veteran, some combat veterans live with trauma that is really hard to live with. And so navigating the way people cope with the pain of the trauma they've experienced, and it's not just veterans. There's a lot of violence in our communities, in our world. There's a lot of people that have suffered violence as young children, and some of those people have a very hard time keeping their life together. They have a lot of personal, internal pain. And one of the ways of dealing with that pain is to engage self-medication, right? And so some people drink, some people use drugs, some people do whatever they can to stop the ghosts from haunting them at night. So that's the chronically homeless in our street. That's the population, people who are dealing with deep, deep trauma. And what happens when you're living on the streets is that you are re-traumatized, that there's a lot of chaos that could make your life that haunt you even more. So the solution to all of this, of course, is housing. There's a push in the state for housing first. And what that means is you give an individual who's been homeless a key in an apartment. No questions asked. It isn't about get sober first and then we'll give you an apartment, or get on medications first and we'll give you an apartment. What we've learned is that you give someone an apartment, provide that sense of safety, that sense of stability, then there's no telling what will happen to that individual and how they will blossom in their own life. So that's a big push in this state.
Also, there's a lot of refugees that have come, for example, from the African continent, who are running from wars, often wars that the United States is involved in because of the resources on the African continent. The United States is really militarizing its foreign policy on the African continent. So Maine has seen a lot of refugees that are running away from that. You've had experience with some of these folks. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So there's two things. There are refugees, and refugees are people who are fleeing war, famine, natural disasters. They end up in refugee camps. The UN helps those individuals navigate what the next step in their life will be because they can't go home. That population is very traumatized, but there's a system by which they can come into this country with Social Security cards, with the capacity to work. They come in with a way to build a life. On the other hand, there are asylum seekers, people who are political activists in their own countries and have been persecuted, tortured, violated in many ways because of the political stance they take in their home country. Those folks come to this country on a visa and apply for asylum, trying to make the case that if they go back to their home country, they will be killed. So those are and there are other categories of immigrants as well. I've sat with both of those, people who have experienced both of those ways of getting into this country. They all have traumatic stories to tell. People have shown me their bullet wounds, their knife wounds. People come to this country to get away from the chaos of their own, to be safe, and to build a safe life for their own children.
The National Priorities Project reports that the Pentagon currently gets 54% of every discretionary tax dollar. Discretionary means the part of the federal budget that Congress actually votes on, that they appropriate. So 54 cents of every tax dollar goes to the Pentagon. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I think that that the budget is a moral document. There are many people out there in the world that argue that it expresses the moral values in our own communities. So the 54 cents to every dollar that goes to the Pentagon is a reality, and because of that, programs that support people who are extremely poor have less money to navigate. There's a lot of things that are frustrating to me about the Pentagon budget, not the least of which is that the Pentagon refuses to be audited, that the Pentagon is well known for wasting money in many dramatic ways. They're not accountable for that huge amount of money that they get every year to spend. And yet, the programs that are supporting people who are poor is where the public discourse goes in terms of where the fraud, waste, and abuse is in our government policies. I feel like it's a manipulated process. And when you work with people who are victims of that manipulation, it's an infuriating reality. The other thing I want to say about that number...
So you're saying that they pick on the social programs, a little bit of waste and fraud and abuse might be there, but the vast majority of it inside the Pentagon budget, nobody talks about it, no big stories in the newspaper about it, and it gets a free ride.
I mean, I think it's the idea of fraud, waste, and abuse, right? People are appalled or furious, rightly so, at an individual who claims to be poor and they're not, or who takes a check that doesn't belong to them. That's an infuriating reality. The amount of money that you can squeeze out of poverty programs by going after that population is peanuts compared to the reality of the fraud, waste, and abuse, if you will, of funds that the Pentagon navigates. But I also want to say that that number that the Pentagon navigates doesn't include other programs that are other military programs like the NSA, the CIA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot more money spent developing nuclear weapons systems. There's a lot more money spent on navigating the war machine than in supporting individuals that are trying to survive day to day.
Yeah. For many years, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, place where you went to undergraduate school, the economics department there at UMass Amherst has been doing a study called the U.S. Employment Effects of Military and Domestic Spending Priorities. I know you're very familiar with this study. Can you just briefly share about it?
Sure.
What it's about?
I mean, the roots of the study exist in, there was a guy named Simo Melman who, sort of the grandfather of what they call the conversion movement. He was a professor at Columbia University who looked at the industrial base of the United States. The truth is, after World War II, what the United States became really good at building, or invested a lot of money into developing, was the weapons industry, right? So the Pentagon had a lot of money to build up various weapons systems, and that became a very profitable business for some. In the 90s, when the Cold War ended, there was a lot of hope and optimism in the country that we could begin to look at those weapons industries and convert them to begin building products that the United States needs, a fast rail system. And now we can sort of talk about alternative energy infrastructure. At the time, there was effort into planning, organizing, and strategically making it happen, that we would convert from this weapons industry that we no longer needed because the Cold War was over, into a consumer-based production facilities that would make what we need to survive.
And the study says that if we did that, we'd get more jobs, right?
Yes, the study says clearly that the Pentagon, the money spent in the weapons industries creates far fewer jobs than if you spent that same amount of money either in, you could put the money in tax breaks and still get more jobs out of it, but you could certainly build rail, solar,
wind,
weatherization, and or put that money into schools or healthcare or whatever. In every instance, you create far more jobs than you do when you're building weapons for the Pentagon.
And with that empirical evidence out there, this study has been repeatedly updated at UMass Amherst Economics Department. Why do you think the politicians who are always talking about creating more jobs and everything else, why do you think they don't turn to that study and advocate for that? Instead, we stay down this continued road of dependence on military production. What do you think the reason is behind that?
I mean, the reasons are multiple. I mean, at the most basic instinct is that people have a hard time with change. And so, if you go into any given community and say, oh, the weapon system that you're building here, we're going to take that money, we're going to stop building that weapon system and start building something else. Well, that process is a long, cumbersome process. People lose their job in that process. There's no politician out there that doesn't want to say, I'm responsible for job loss, right? It needs to be a planned, organized effort. There's no incentive for it. The companies or the military-industrial complex, the groups that are building these weapon systems, are paying for the campaigns for the individuals who want to keep their jobs in Congress. So therefore, the Pentagon understands that there are certain weapon systems that they don't need anymore. And when they go to Congress and say, we want to take this weapon system out of the mix, Congress overrides them and says, we're going to keep these jobs in our community. It's a really sad process. It's unimaginative, it's uncreative, it's profit-driven for individuals. It has nothing to do with what communities need. I think, it really does leave communities at great risk. If this particular plant that makes this particular weapon system, if that's all you got going in your little community, you're at great risk for that money to go away at any point in time.
Especially at a time when America is facing such massive debt and the economy could go into free fall collapse at any point, and suddenly that dries up, right? That money for that weapon system dries up, and that town is really in big trouble.
Well, I can talk to you at length about the anguish that happens when people lose everything they have. It's a really hard road to climb back from. And people are doing it every day. It's very painful. And we should be protecting our communities from the dangers and the risks of that. We should be building for conversion.
Let me read this to you, a quote from Martin Luther King, just before he was killed, said, quote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." Why do you think that our nation is not answering this moral challenge offered by Dr. King so many years ago?
Well, I mean, I think that we just talked about the budget being a moral issue, that the bigger moral issues are not part of the conversation. Who should live and die is not part of the big conversation.
Why is that? Why isn't it more of the conversation? What's the obstacle? What's the obstruction?
I think, obviously, sort of we have a dysfunctional political system. We have a very dysfunctional political system. And the truth about what is happening in our community infrastructure of military production at the heart of your country, when those are the jobs that provide union wages and health insurance, when that's where you have to go to earn a living and to educate your children, and there are very few other options, what does that do? What is that saying about the soul of the community? We need endless war to maintain this permanent war economy infrastructure, right? And that is tragic. There are other ways to earn a living. We don't have to be invading countries. we need to be clear about why we are invading other countries. We need to be clear about the resource extraction that is going on around the world and what we're really after. We go to war, we don't tell the truth about why we're going to war. And then people die, and we don't watch those deaths. We don't see those deaths. Those deaths happen without debate in our country. We've given it all over. On the other hand, there are huge numbers of people who are in the trenches with people, helping to support individuals survive this this chaos that we're living in. And I think that speaks to the better nature of the world that we live in. I mean, I see it every day. I see the power of love and compassion in action and what it means to individual lives. And I think that's the essence, the true essence of our country. It's up to us to figure out how to generate the debate and make that the priority conversation in our country.
And what do you think a person listening to this show that is moved to want to do something, but they feel kind of despairing about the current political situation in the nation, what would you offer them as advice on what we can do?
I would go to a poem written by Miller Williams. To me, this is a place to start, right? It's a very short poem. It says, "Have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. What seems conceit, bad manners, or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on down there where the spirit meets the bone." I think that compassion is a place to start. Martin Luther King said it. We need to get grounded in the spiritual reality of what is the meaning of life. We need to stop judging each other, understand that people are suffering in deep and profound ways, and to start there. Let us understand that compassion drives the work that we do. It should be driving our foreign policy. It should be driving certainly our federal budget, and it should be driving our local budgets. Let us hear the words of Martin Luther King and regain our spiritual life as community. That's where I would start.
Wow, very good start. Mary Beth Sullivan, thank you very much for coming on the show. And thank you for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.